Thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk a little about Memphis Minnie, who was named Memphis Minnie by the record companies. And actually, they deepened the confusion because she actually made her career in Chicago. So she was born in Algiers. They found her in Memphis, and she became famous and made a living in Chicago. And she was, during her time, easily the most popular female blues musician of the 20s and 30s, except for Bessie Smith. So I would imagine that most of you have heard of Bessie Smith. I see a little show of hands if you have. That's a lot of hands. And the number of people who knew Memphis Minnie before they walked in here. There's a few hands, but not as many. She never got her due for a lot of reasons, some of which I want to talk about. And because she never got her due, she was forgotten. She's been remembered now by younger women blues musicians who've taken her as a model. So they've really been the ones to resurrect her career. It hasn't been the historians, it hasn't been the critics, it hasn't been the people who are even into roots music. But it's the people who are playing music and find a really inspiring and progressive model. And that's part of the reason why she was forgotten. She wasn't a tragic figure at all. She was a very self-made woman. She was very powerful. She took control of her career. She determined pretty much the course of her career in her music throughout her life. And that, if you know anything at all about roots music, is not an easy thing to do. If you're a poor black musician, you're being taken advantage of at almost every turn. She got taken advantage of, but she stayed with it, and she came back from it, and she was very tough. She was tough enough that by the end of her, in their late 40s, in 1942, she impressed the poet Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes, you probably know, show of hands, Langston Hughes, the great poet of the Harlem Renaissance. Like all great poets and all great writers, he was actually just doing a writing gig. So he got a gig on New Year's Eve, 1942, to write a piece on Memphis Minnie, who was playing at the 230 Club in Chicago. And he wrote this for the Chicago Defender. The Chicago Defender was a national newspaper. It was one that was mainly written and published for black audiences. Memphis Minnie was mainly produced and sold to black audiences. But Memphis Minnie was a big hero in those circles, and she'd done something that no one had done before. She became one of the very first people to start using electrified instruments, to start playing electric guitar. So this was impressive enough for Langston Hughes to go and see her and write the following piece. Memphis Minnie sits on top of the icebox at the 230 Club in Chicago and beats out blues on an electric guitar. A little dun-colored drummer who chews gum in tempo accompanies her as the year's end, 1942, flickers to nothing and goes out like a melted candle. Midnight. The electric guitar is very loud, science having magnified all its softness away. Memphis Minnie sings through a microphone, and her voice, hard and strong anyhow for a little woman's, is made harder and stronger by scientific sound. The singing, the electric guitar, and the drums are so hard and so loud, amplified as they are by General Electric, that sometimes the voice, the words, and melody get lost under sheer noise, leaving only the rhythm to come through. That rhythm fills the 230 Club with a deep and dusky heartbeat that overrides all modern amplification. That rhythm is as old as Memphis Minnie's most remote ancestor. Memphis Minnie's feet in her high-heel shoes keep time to the music of her electric guitar. Her thin legs move like musical pistons, which need oil too. She's a slender, light brown woman who looks like an old maid schoolteacher with a sly sense of humor. She wears glasses that fail to hide her bright, bird-like eyes. She dresses neatly and sits straight in her chair, perched on top of the icebox where the beer is kept. Before she plays, she cocks her head to one side like a bird, glances from her place on top of the box to the crowded bar below, frowns quizzically, and looks more than ever like a colored teacher lady in a neat southern schoolroom about to say, "Children, the lesson is on page 14 today, paragraph 2. But Memphis Minnie says nothing of the sort. Instead, she grabs the microphone and yells, "Hey now!" Then she hits a few deep chords, leans forward ever so slightly over the guitar, bows her head, and begins to beat out a good old steady down-home rhythm on the strings. A rhythm so contagious that often it makes the crowd holler out loud. Then Minnie smiles, her gold teeth flash for a split second. Her earrings tremble. Her left hand with dark red nails moves up and down the strings of the guitar's neck. Her right hand, the one with the dice ring on it, picks out the tune, throbs out the rhythm, and beats out the blues. Then, through the smoke and racket of the noisy Chicago bar, float Louisiana bayous, muddy old swamps, Mississippi dust and sun, cotton fields, lonesome trains, train whistles in the night, mosquitoes at dawn, and the rural free delivery that never comes. All these things cry through the strings on Memphis Minnie's electric guitar, amplified to machine proportions, a musical version of Electric Welders plus a rolling mill. Part of the reason I wanted to read that was because that's pretty much what Muddy Waters' Chicago Blues Band sounded like. I'm old enough to have been fortunate enough to have seen Muddy Waters' band when he was still alive, and it felt and sounded exactly like a machine, a pile driver. It had a machine-like force to it. This was way before Muddy Waters electrified. In 1942, it's not clear because these are marginalized people about whom records are not well kept. But around 1942, Muddy Waters may have been playing electric guitar, he may not have. It's pretty clear that the one thing that Memphis Minnie did was she organized a band and created that sound with the piano player, with the drums and the bass, and that forceful machine-like sound to it that later became the basis for the Chicago Blues Band. If Memphis Minnie's not the most famous American blues musician you've never heard of, certainly she's the most famous American blues woman you've never heard of. A genuine trailblazer from the 1920s to the 1930s. I wrote this and I don't even really need to read it. She was the second most recorded female blues musician in the country. The first was Bessie Smith, but Bessie Smith didn't play guitar, or write her own songs, or forge a career spanning 4 decades under a brand new paradigm. The female band leader, singer, songwriter, guitarist. And unlike Memphis Minnie, Bessie Smith didn't dominate the age of acoustic blues while clearly pioneering the age of electrified blues bands. Neither has Bessie Smith proved to be the enduring cultural figure Memphis Minnie has, becoming a source of inspiration to latter-day blues women and experiencing a remarkable historical reassessment that's still ongoing. Bonnie Raitt, who's about the closest analog that we have to Memphis Minnie. In fact, I remember as a young boy seeing Bonnie Raitt and seeing a woman for the first time stand in front of a band with an electric guitar and sort of take that stance, that band leader stance, and be the band leader. And I didn't know why, but I couldn't make sense of it. I'd never seen anything like that. I didn't realize that actually women could do this. Bonnie Raitt has done it for an equally long time and done it incredibly well. She had this to say about Memphis Minnie. She said Minnie is one of American music history's most vibrant and pioneering artists. As one of the first women singer-songwriter guitarists ever to reach stardom, the story of her life in music, both on and off the stage, during one of the most important and formative periods of the origins of American popular music is an indelible, crucial window into that history. The thing that strikes me is, if she's so important, why don't we know more about her? Bonnie Raitt's comment about the origins of American music, American popular music, the most important and formative period, struck me just last night. When the very first music was recorded and sold, it was recorded and sold to a mainstream audience who bought opera, classical music, popular music of the day. And then there were two very important markets. One was black music sold to black people, and white music sold to white people. One was called race music, which today makes us feel a little bit creepy, and hillbilly music, which ought to make us feel a little bit creepy. But in fact, just 2 days ago, I saw the Country Music Awards, and the Country Music Awards are hillbilly music dressed up and glamorized. And the urban music market today is pretty much the race music market, dressed up and glamorized. So when Bonnie says that this period of the 1920s, 1930s, pre-World War II, is a really important and formative period, she's right. We don't have a lot of windows into that period. We're just reassessing that period. There are historians now who are saying that the idea that somebody like Robert Johnson ought to be considered a major blues man is a little bit silly, because Robert Johnson wasn't being listened to by many people at the time. They've finally gone back and looked at who made how many records, who sold how many records, who was really being listened to. And the list is surprising. There's a man named Elijah Wald who wrote a book called Escaping the Delta. And there's a list in it of the top 15 artists. And you'll be surprised to see who's on that list. You'll also be surprised to read the article on Memphis Minnie and see just how long and how important and how pioneering her career was. And to imagine that she's not really recognized even as one of our black heroes. So I made some quick notes, and I want to just say one more thing. Oh, I do want to tell you that, yeah, her Memphis Minnie's biography, which was published in 1974, 1973, is called Woman with Guitar, and it's being republished next month. And it was written by a man named Paul Guerin, who is both a blues musicologist and a surrealist specialist. So he called the book Woman with Guitar, I guess with pretty much of a purpose, a double-edged purpose. The other thing I want to say is that we don't pay enough attention to people like Memphis Minnie. In Memphis Minnie's case, the reasons are fairly obvious. Race, gender, even the stereotype of the typical blues person. Again, Billie Holiday, show of hands. Billie Holiday led a tragic life. It turns out that most of the people who get the most attention from the world of blues and jazz tend to be people who've led tragic lives. They tend to be tragic heroes. In the world of white jazz, Paul Butterbeck, the cornetist, was one of the very first people who was lionized because he was an alcoholic and died very young. The same thing happens over and over again. The more pathetic a person becomes, the more they fit our image of, oh yeah, they're singing the real blues. Bonnie Raitt makes the case that in Memphis Minnie's case, that she's not only singing the blues, she's not only telling you about the world around her, she's telling you about her own life as the world around her goes on and takes shape. So she has an autobiography to give you. It's in no way pathetic or tragic. It is after she stops singing and after she falls out of music, she doesn't have any money. And she winds up in the healthcare system, she winds up not being able to pay for a nursing home. She doesn't get a gravestone until 1996, when Bonnie Raitt pays for it. She hasn't got a tribute album until 2 years ago when Maria Muldaur made a very nice tribute album. Now her biography's coming out. The question that I always want to ask is, why don't we put more value on that part of our culture, on those people? To me, it's a simple question of really a value, of assessing value. What is it worth in terms of even support of the endowment, which paid for me to be able to go and look at Memphis Minnie's life, write the article, draw your attention to her situation. We don't really in America, partly because the arts are so commercialized, pay much attention to it. But I want to give you two examples that I think are worth considering. One is that since Katrina, when Katrina happened, there was some thought that those forms of uncommercial community art that flow from the streets of New Orleans might be threatened. The Indians, the second line clubs, all of the neighborhoods where they lived were decimated and still are decimated. It may not be, most of you may not drive through those neighborhoods on a regular basis, but if you just take a turn and take a shortcut through Central City, I think you'll be surprised at how few people are living there, at how empty the streets are still. It's been a concern of mine, a nagging concern, and at a certain point, I checked the Census Bureau statistics, and it turns out that between the year 2000 and the year 2010, there are 107,000 fewer black residents in New Orleans. That's 100,000 people missing. We don't know they're missing. The Indians seem to have come back with greater flair and more color. The second line clubs also seem to have come back with more flair and more color. But how much of that is a sort of defiant show of strength on their part? And how much of it is going to be weakened by the fact that the neighborhoods will eventually not be rebuilt. The neighborhood connections will not be rebuilt. The family connections won't be rebuilt. The residents won't come back. There are still residents who want to come back here. There's still people building low-cost housing to try to bring people back here. So there's a very real example of the ways in which we don't value things, we don't pay attention to really what's going on. Another one is that just in the last few years, I have noticed that in Arcadia, in Acadiana, I just call it Cajun land, there has been a remarkable, really remarkable resurgence of young bands, young creative bands, who are taking a really deep, deep, deep belief in the traditions of Cajun music and turning it into something that then becomes music that is comfortable to them, to what they grew up listening to rock and roll. They're making amazing albums, there really are. A couple of them that I've just heard that aren't out yet, but are the leading bands. One is called Fou-Follet, and the other is called Bonsoir Catin, which is an all-women's band. They both have amazing records that are coming out soon. In their minds, they're having a renaissance. They're crowding the dance floors. They're having their own cultural festivals. There's a festival called the Black Pot Festival, which is mainly these young people gathering together in the Acadian village that they have in the center of Lafayette. and partying and having jambalaya contests in the big black pots. It's amazing what these kids are doing. The problem is that the very first Cajun revivals began about 30 or 40 years ago. 30 or 40 years ago, there was such a concern that a group was funded, it's still state funded, called Codafil. We say Codafil, they say Codafil. Codafil, the purpose of Codafil was to increase the number of French-speaking residents and to spread French-speaking culture within the state and strengthen it. When they started, there were 500,000 French-speaking residents in that part of the country. Today, there are 150,000. And the number has just gone steadily down. I love the fact there's a resurgence. I don't love the fact that we're blind to the other factors that are going on here. That in fact, we may, a small group of us may, value something, but we don't spend enough time looking at its general value within the general community and trying to speak up for it. So in a sense, I'm giving a little pledge here. I'm asking you to support LEH and all it does. But in other ways, to think about the same thing too. I, at a certain point, did some thinking about the music communities here and tourism. And it struck me very quickly that the problem, for instance, with the New Orleans Musicians Clinic, when they have a budget problem, when they have a money crunch, they're talking about $10,000. They're talking about $50,000. When tourism wants to do something, they're talking about $10 million. They're talking about $100 million, $200 million, just to put on an ad campaign that's going to feature the same musicians who don't have health care, who have to go to the New Orleans Musicians Clinic to get health care. So something is wrong with that picture. In my mind, what's wrong with it is we need something like a Music Heritage Commission. You know, we wouldn't be the sports city we were if it weren't for 30 or 40 years ago, civic leaders got together and formed a sports commission to promote the idea of professional sports. Well, a Music Heritage Commission could do the same thing. I thought about it, especially when a graduate student last year came to me and said that she was studying city planning and she was interested in this, and she wanted to know where the New Orleans Music Museum was. Where is the New Orleans Music Museum? There are many of them, but one of the problems that we have is that this community tends to be divided by self-interest. You know, we're like England, we're two similar countries divided by a common language. There are many museums here and many places where historians can go. But if you're a visitor and you don't know anything about New Orleans music and you happen to wind up in New Orleans tomorrow night and you say to somebody, I hear this is an incredible music city, where do I go to find out about it this weekend? Where do you go? I think those questions are really important. And I think organizations like this are really important. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you.